Yeah, you're speaking. Yeah. Just hold it.
Okay, I'll just hold it. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first of our annual church history lectures that we've had in person for the last 3 years. The last 2 years, because the last one we had was actually 2 years ago in 2020. But we're delighted to be back in person. And if you're not able to be with us in person, we're delighted that you've joined us online, and it's really good to have this facility. Today we're delighted to have Dr. Zachary Purvis as our speaker. Zach is the course organizer and lecturer in church history here at ETS, and he also serves as program leader for our master's program in Scottish church history and theology. He studied first at WTS, Westminster at California, before his DPhil at Oxford. And he spent some time next door in New College as a research fellow before his most recent term in the University of Göttingen. So we are delighted to have him as a speaker. His subject is Reformers with Inky Fingers. I have no idea what is going to come, but that's the surprise, and we look forward very much indeed to what he has to say to us. Dr. Purvis.
Thank you. Let me say what a great privilege it is to be here with you all in this beautiful room as I look around here and see all the theologians who belong to this institution's tradition. I'm reminded of the old adage that children are better to be seen than heard, but I suppose you'll have to suffer through whatever I have to say anyway. Very thankful to the principal for the invitation. When I gave my title, I was asked what exactly it meant, or what it was that I was really going to address. And it so happened at the time I was reading through a biography of the 20th century American novelist John Updike, and couldn't help but think of an interview that Updike gave several years before his death. He had just published a new novel, and the interviewer said to him, "Mr. Updike, tell us what your novel's about." And Updike, in his somewhat sly manner, said, "Well, it's about what it says." And this clearly threw off the interviewer, who then cleared his throat and said, "Well, I guess what I'm asking is, could you tell us what it's about in other words?" And Updike paused, and then he said, "Well, I guess if I could have told you what it was about in other words, I would have." Well, truth be told, I was perhaps not exactly biding my time to figure things out, but pulling together a number of different strands, different projects I've been involved with over the past few years under this enigmatic theme, Reformers with Inky Fingers, but I suppose all will become clear momentarily. Early in the 16th century, Thomas Platter and 5 of his friends stopped on their way from Zurich to St. Gallen. At Mass, one of the priests called them heretics because they came from a city that rejected papal supremacy. Zurich, of course, was already on the path to Protestantism through the efforts of Huldrych Zwingli. Platter asked the priest why the Pope was head of the church. The priest answered, "For this reason, that St. Peter was the Pope at Rome and has there given the papacy over to his successors." "But St. Peter," Platter replied, "has never once been in Rome." Platter then pulled out from his bag his New Testament and showed the priest how in the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 16, Paul sends greetings to so many, but does not even think of mentioning Peter. "Ah, but," the priest objected, thinking perhaps of the 2nd century apocryphal Acts of Peter, "when Christ met Peter outside Rome and asked where he was going, Peter answered, 'To Rome, to allow myself to be crucified.'" Platter asked where the priest had read this, and the priest said his grandmother told him the story. "Ah," said Platter with rapier wit, "so I perceive truly that your grandmother is your Bible." It's hard to know how to read such a tale. Platter may have embellished it when he recorded it in his memoirs. He seems to have had a knack for that. He records how he used to sneak away at night from his apprenticeship duties as a rope maker when he was a boy, not to cavort in houses of ill repute, but to read Homer and Pindar in Greek by candlelight. Talk about a misspent youth. Either way, it is a dramatic story. The priest is a transmitter of an oral spiderweb tradition, and Platter, the young humanist, is equipped with critical faculties of reading and interpreting because he has always privileged the written word. Before long, Platter would settle in Basel, Switzerland, that thriving hub of humanism and Renaissance print culture, and with 3 new friends, he founded a printing house and taught himself to become a master printer. And it was there that he met John Calvin. In 1535 and 6, Platter would print the first edition of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. In the end, it turns out Platter was not a great printer. Calvin complained the work took over 6 months to complete and was riddled with typographical errors. But he was a welcome partner in the Reformation. So here I want to venture into and poke around the world of the Reformers and their relation to the Word, both written and often, but not always, printed. On one hand, the connection is hardly new to scholars. Decades ago, for example, Elizabeth Eisenstein launched 1,000 inquiries in both appreciation and denigration when she argued that the shift from script to print through Gutenberg's movable type gave birth to modern culture and shape to the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. In recent years, pioneering historians such as Thomas Kaufmann and Andrew Pettigrew have offered vibrant color and subtle shading to that stark outline. Martin Luther, we know, was a regular visitor at printing shops and fully aware of the revolutionary aspects of the enterprise. He learned, but he almost seems to have known by instinct that a treatise of 8 pages was ideal for the printer, who could then avoid having to manipulate the paper and save time. It's not just Calvinists, but also Lutherans who are interested in saving time. And to save another crucial of resources. Workmen in the press, after they had pulled sheets from the printing shop, sometimes received for their efforts not only wages in silver and gold coin, but also in mugs of beer. Luther invented as well a new form of theological writing, in the German vernacular, lucid, accessible, and not least short. And with Lucas Cranach, he transformed the title page, giving books of all kinds a new look, and books from Wittenberg a striking and easily identifiable brand. All this, even as we must remember that good wine needs no bush, the story of the medium cannot be substituted for the story of the message. On the other hand, though, it seems fruitful, perhaps, still to ask some wide-ranging, if therefore potentially unanswerable questions. What happened to the physical books and papers and letters nimbly penned by the Reformers? What were conditions like while they labored, while their works were disseminated and inventoried and bought and sold and lost or destroyed? How do we make sense of the great many assembled editions of their texts, above all the collected editions that appeared already during their own lifetime? How else, we might ask, does attention to these, as I've termed them, inky realities of the Reformation benefit us even now? So let me emphasize from the beginning here that this is not a complete, entire map in any sense. It's nothing close to that, but only a few very tentative steps across vast and rough terrain. In the first place, the written record of the Reformation stretches extremely far and wide. Luther sent his first letter, as far as anyone can tell, to the Eisenach vicar Johann Braun in April 1507. Calvin dictated his last will and testament, as everyone here surely knows, from the final version of Theodore Beza's Life of Calvin to the Genevan notary public Pierre Chenelat in April 1564. Between these 2 Aprils, the period in between swarms with hundreds of thousands of documents in every genre, size, and condition. This does not even include the tidal wave of pamphlet literature, or Flugschriften as it's known, which numbered in the millions that the printing presses poured over Europe. In other words, the Reformation world overflowed with oily black ink. True, Luther described the church not as a pen house, but as a mouth house, which hears and speaks God's word. When he described what preachers do, he said that they shout the word from the pulpit in its 2 kinds of speech, rightly dividing law and gospel, and indeed all Protestants in the Reformation agreed with him. Properly then, the organ of the church is the ear, not the eye, nor the hand, for the church lives by hearing the promises of God by faith, not yet beholding them fully in sight. Early on, Luther explained his own role in the Reformation of the church with his characteristic precision. He said, "I slept or drank Wittenberg beer with my friends Philip and Amsdorf. I did nothing. The Word, capital W, did everything." But he also wrote day and night on all topics that confronted late medieval and early modern society. Nothing went ignored, and soon he became the most published author in the history of Christianity. "The pen is light," he affirmed. "All that is needed is a goose feather, and you can find one anywhere," though, he added, the whole body and soul work at it too. Luther, of course, did not act alone. No men were busier than his fellow reformers, humanists and statesmen, schoolmen and churchmen. They too labored for reform, for the proper understanding of the word to which their words were in service, all with paper and ink, unceasingly and at dizzying speed. The learned Martin Bucer was unmatched as an administrator of the Reformation in places like Strasbourg and Oxford. "I am amazed, for I have never seen Bucer inactive," confirmed the Italian exile Peter Martyr Vermigli, who spent weeks in Bucer's household when he left Lucca. Never one to miss an opportunity, Bucer crammed each of his numerous tracts and commentaries to the brim, so much so that Calvin observed, "He does not know how to take his hand off the writing pad, does he?" Calvin himself was the master of brevity, yet he was a prodigious writer overall and almost always worked in a great hurry as deadlines pressed. "I hardly know what I have written here," he confessed in a postscript to a note for Pierre Viret, "because my eyesight is so blurred from my constant writing." When the reformers let up writing, to preach, for example, transcribers invariably copied out what they said, and often their bent nibs accompanied them to their end. Ulrich von Hutten, the soldier poet who fought the papacy, and Desiderius Erasmus, died on a tiny island in Lake Zurich. "He has left nothing of value," Zwingli observed, "nothing but a pen." What happened to their personal books and letters and papers after their demise is far from straightforward. Of late, Scott Dixon, Stefan Rhine, and others have reconstructed in rich detail the convoluted search for the lost books of Luther and other early Reformation associates. For example, between the 27th of May, 1564, the date of Calvin's death, and the 19th of August, 1564, the date of the candid preface that Beza gave to Calvin's commentaries on the book of Joshua, the preface which became the outline for the first Calvin biography, there was a sale in Geneva of remarkable books that had previously belonged to the great reformer. It was his brother, Antoine Calvin, who quickly had John's works, his books sold in order to be able to honor his last will and testament. There was a call there to distribute sums of money that Calvin had bequeathed to his nieces, his nephews, to the Genevan Academy and the Bourse Française, a charity organization that helped destitute immigrants and financed religious instruction. When the Council of Geneva learned of the sale, they instructed Beza to buy certain books, swooping in to give him a kind of right of preemption. He chose books by Calvin and books annotated by Calvin, including the Parisian edition of the works of John Chrysostom, an edition of the Tragedies of Seneca, bound with the Pharsalia of Lucan, titles from Heinrich Bullinger, Vermigli, and Johannes Alasco. The Genevan Council Register later confirms, Monsieur de Beze, Theodore Beza, has now stopped buying for the Academy library books from the late Calvin, which are good and clean, that is, unmarked or unannotated. Calvin's personal library numbered probably closer to 200 than 300 books, and fewer than 200 entered the library of the Genevan Academy, which was an infant institution founded only in 1559. Only within the last few years, though, have these been subjected to any kind of scrutiny. Max Angomar happened upon a copy of the definitive 1559 Latin edition of the Institutes on a tour through the Genevan Reading Society's library, just before the pandemic, in fact, in 2018, and found a copy overloaded with more than 100 corrective notes that show how Calvin read and rewrote the 1553 edition of the Institutes. and how Antoine and his other secretaries collaborated in what has been called provocatively the Calvin factory. As we know, Theodore Beza suggested that the Genevan Academy also purchased Peter Martyr Vermigli's library after his death in 1562. The books were eventually sent from Zurich, where Vermigli died, to Geneva 4 years later. It took the Academy 4 more years to realize that they should catalog the collection of books. And at that point, the council again had to intervene and instruct the rector of the Academy to chain the inventory to the shelf so that it would not be mislaid. Curiously, though, Beza's own library went elsewhere, even before he breathed his last in 1605. Although born into the French lesser nobility, Beza had surrendered most of his rights of inheritance when he left France for Geneva in 1548. After 40 years there, and crippling inflation and the financial demands of a large household, he had almost nothing to his name. By 1592, he was forced to sell his library to a young count from Bohemia to stave off complete financial disaster. Personal libraries can provide special insight into how the reformers wielded the pen and approached texts, sometimes with the caution of a herpetologist sneaking up on a cobra, other times supplying their own venom. The University Library of Groningen in the Netherlands possesses a remarkable book previously owned by Luther, a 1527 edition of the New Testament by Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus's New Testament, first published in 1516, contained the Greek text, Erasmus's own translation into Latin, and his technical commentary, which justified the choices he had made. And it was a signal achievement. The first Greek New Testament accessible to many in Western Europe by means of the printing press, and a new Latin form, of course, to improve on Jerome's Old Vulgate. Luther's general antipathy to Erasmus, the preeminent Renaissance scholar north of the Alps, is rather well known. Luther would call him things like Christ's chief enemy in 1,000 years. But what exactly does that mean? Luther's book promises more illumination, for he filled it with the distinctive chicken scratches of his marginalia. More than 200 handwritten notes in both Latin and German reveal his opinion on what he read. When Luther acquired it, probably in 1528, he had already engaged in brutal polemic with Erasmus on free will and salvation and on the means to reform the church. What drew Luther's ire was not humanist scholarship, the interest in languages, rhetoric, history, poetry, the return to classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome. In fact, Luther himself qualifies as a humanist, or at least a great friend of humanists, under any sane definition of the term. He had even used an earlier edition of Erasmus's work when he made his own translation of the New Testament in the Wartburg into German in 1522. Yet Luther remained forever suspicious that Erasmus hid behind his sophisticated literary abilities to mask a lack of trust in Scripture. And so in his copy of the book, he's quick to sniff out what he thinks are points of Erasmus's disingenuousness, sometimes in rather unusual passages. When Erasmus came to Ephesians 1:23, he pointed out 2 possible meanings of a Greek verbal form, passive or middle. Luther read this as an attempt not to understand, but to undermine the text, the style in which Erasmus wrote, put philology in the service of skepticism. So Luther jotted down in the margin what he took to be Erasmus's real intent. He wrote, "And therefore one should not believe anything of Paul in the entire gospel, but what else does Epicurus say, who does not know Christ, indeed who considers it a fairy tale?" More striking is the battle waged over 1 Corinthians 7:39. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Erasmus's annotation to this verse ran to some 10 pages, the longest in his book. He argued every side of the question of divorce and remarriage and heaped up citations from every church father. Finally, though, he expressed doubt whether the church could ever be free from error. At this point, Luther was ready with the pen. "Oh, Erasmus, a skeptic, he always has doubts about everything." At other places, Luther detected the voice of a biting humorist. In notes on Ephesians 1:13 and 4:8, he thought Erasmus proudly satirized the text. Thus, Luther wrote in the margin at these points, "Laugh, laugh please." In another passage, again 1 Corinthians 7:39, Erasmus referred to the practice of indulgences with sharp irony. He said, "The Pope has mercy on souls in purgatory, if only this extended to souls on earth." Surely Luther agreed, but an edition of the New Testament, Luther thought, was no place for this kind of idle wisecrack. So he responded, pen in hand, "O Erasmus, do not laugh yourself to death." At the Wittenberg dinner table, Luther summed up his complaint about Erasmus. If he can joke about just one letter, he will do so. True, Luther certainly believed in humor as much as he did in grammatical knowledge about the Bible. You only need to spend 2 seconds with Luther to know that. Where there is faith, one should laugh, he affirmed. But God does not allow himself and his greatness to be mocked. Of course, whether Luther read Erasmus with precision on every point is arguable at best, and he was aware of this. He read critically, intentionally, even with rather extreme cases of hostility. When Erasmus suggested with a playful cavalier tone how to punctuate Luke 2:13 and 14, and begged the benevolence of his kind reader, as he put it, to agree with him, Luther lost his patience. "I am not a kind reader," he scribbled on the page. "You are not a kind writer." Marginal comments are perhaps not so marginal after all. What about collected editions? It was again the prolific Erasmus who told the closest of his friends how he dreamt that someday, even if only after his death, his writings might be gathered up into a collected edition as a monument to his landmark achievements. The first collected editions of the works of the Reformers came, not at the end, but at the beginning of the Reformation, for Luther as early as 1518. Great publishers across Europe printed their books and letters in table talk. Great polymaths, literal and spiritual heirs of the Reformers, competed to edit them, setting the agenda for all subsequent compilers. Lutherans in Wittenberg and Jena battled each other with rival editions of Luther's works after his death. The Philippists, as they were called in Wittenberg, and the Genesio Lutherans, or so-called true or genuine Lutherans in Jena during the mid-16th century. And again, the Irenic theologians in Helmstedt and the strict theologians in Wittenberg during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Each a well-known case of religious tension and strife that accompanied the late Reformation and the rise and consolidation of confessional cultures. The Reformed in Geneva, for their part, battled not with other Calvinists, but with an outbreak of the plague to gather Calvin's correspondence after his death. From the 16th century to the Enlightenment, some of the most innovative European scholars, all of them I think we could term a monster of erudition, brought out with heroic industry ever more editions of ever more Reformation texts, many called opera omnia. Like skilled tailors, the editors of these volumes made alterations, sometimes cutting unseemly passages, sometimes embroidering with fanciful details. They moved freely between Latin and the vernacular, modified style and substance, dated and sometimes misdated events, revealed and concealed names, and constructed an armature of paratexts, dedications, prefaces, tables of contents, subheadings, indexes, lists of emendations, and much more, to guide readers and to thank patrons as much as to claim authority and quite simply to show off. For centuries, they quarreled and agonized over the best methods to meet demand, to encourage scholarship and reform, and to control the legacy of the reformers themselves. Even into the 19th century, this sort of textual altercation continued apace. In 1826, Friedrich Perthes, the German publisher known from Athens to Edinburgh, collaborated with Hans Lorenz Andreas Wendt, a staunch Lutheran conservative pastor in Kiel, to serve the public interest with a collection of Luther's devotional texts under the title Dr. Martin Luther's Works, a selection that takes account of the needs of our time, in 10 small volumes. Their goal was simple. The only thing, they said, that is important in our selection from Luther's writings is to let the old champion of the faith resound once more, so as to awaken and strengthen belief and revelation in the hearts of our contemporaries. But when the first volume appeared, it was met by scholars with gall and malice, and one of the all-time greats about complaints of book sizes in publishing. Luther in Sexto Decimo, ran the review, is our age to be so humored? Won't the dainty, smooth look of this modern format compromise the serious impression, the feeling of awe before the great church father? Will Luther in a lady's knitting bag still guide Protestants like a beacon? Should all things be made common? It was a great sense of exploration and invention, however, that kept such overfamiliarity at bay. New manuscripts seemed to lurk around every corner, waiting to be discovered and included. The Saxon antiquary Johann Georg Leuchtfeld claimed that on a stroll through the medieval town of Quedlinburg, he found and rescued from the street gutter letters from Luther to Philip Melanchthon and Justus Jonas. David Richter, who wrote the genealogy of the Luthers, estimated at the time that 2/3 of Luther's correspondence was missing. Casualties of war, theft, negligence, time, and not least, hungry mice. Johann Jakob Wettstein achieved renown as a pioneering text critic of the New Testament and a Socinian sympathizer in the 18th century, but he also unearthed in the Netherlands, though exactly where and how he never said, a cache of 49 new letters from John Calvin. Johann Salomo Semler, the German Enlightenment theologian, spent much of his honeymoon in that most romantic of places, dusty German libraries, where he discovered previously unknown letters from Melanchthon and Joachim Camerarius the Elder to the Greek Patriarch of Constantinople. Even in 1823, 2 theology students bought items from a junk shop in Geneva. The retailer wrapped their goods in sheets of Calvin's manuscript sermons, written in the hand of Calvin's stenographer. When the Geneva newspaper broke the story, the Genevan librarian wrote an op-ed to try to explain how it was not him, but his predecessor, Jean Senebier, in 1805, who had sold the library's duplicate titles to raise funds and, of course, preserve shelf space. When the buyers arrived, the former librarian threw in for good measure large folios of Calvin's sermons in manuscript, kept in the library for centuries because no one then thought them important. The Geneva newspaper at this point quipped, "Perhaps it was better to let the public believe that Calvin's manuscripts had disappeared than to tell the public that they had, according to an actual rational decision, been sold by weight of paper. Would the caliphate have decided otherwise?" During this period, of course, intellectuals of very different kinds regarded the improvement of earlier editions of the Reformist text to be of paramount concern. Generations of scholars tried their hand at revision, collating variant texts and inspecting, whenever possible, the prized autograph of a Reformation author. Critical, complete, corrected editions of texts promised the ability to revolutionize the church and its theology, politics and historical precedents, and so much more. Nowhere is this better seen than in Philip Melanchthon. Late in 1538, Luther wrote to Melanchthon, his Wittenberg colleague. He had just finished reading Melanchthon's latest manuscript, what became On the Authority of the Church and the Writings of the Ancient Fathers, which would be published in 1539. As he thumbed through it, he told Melanchthon, his head swirled with thoughts of Aristotle, and his chest in turn with indigestion. What made him dyspeptic, he said, is the manuscript's material cause. In Aristotle's philosophy, of course, the stuff out of which a thing is made is the material cause. Marble is the material cause of the sculpture. The material cause, he wrote, "Oh, Melanchthon, so much paper has been consumed by you. Several times you filled one sheet with only 3 words, crossing out all the letters in between." Of course, Luther's comment about this, the length of the document and the logic of Aristotle, is only a bad joke, the kind that appeals probably only to seminarians. In truth, he came up smiling from each inky page. Few texts of the period stated so clearly whether and in what sense the fathers and councils of the church could be considered sources for Christian doctrine. The answer to that question represented one of Luther and Melanchthon's greatest collaborations. Soon Luther finished his own work on the nature of the church, and both men intended their tracts to be read together. But Luther's feeble punchline is striking too, for almost no one wrote more than Melanchthon, and certainly no one did with such careful deliberation. Melanchthon's name indeed calls to mind a lost world. He was both a great humanist and a great reformer. He first appeared in print when barely a teenager, enrolled at the University of Heidelberg in 1510, and he never stopped writing. He authored some of the most important books in the early modern period on Latin and Greek grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, and history, influential studies in physics, psychology, and astronomy, the first summary of Protestant theology in his Loci Communis, and the first Protestant commentaries on the Gospel of John, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and of course, the Epistle to the Romans. He wrote 5 commentaries on the Epistle to the Romans. He also wrote the Augsburg Confession and defended it in the Apology. When he died in 1560, he left behind some 10,000 letters, reflecting an extensive network of correspondence and a remarkable degree of influence. Over 3 times more letters than Erasmus. Some of his works, though, especially the letters, can be hard to read and to put into the correct chronological order. Melanchthon frequently omitted dates from his letters, or gave, perhaps, from the perspective of a 21st century reader, rather unhelpful dates. You can find him dating a letter 5,521 years after the creation of Adam and Eve. Not sure if you know when that is. In other cases, he liked to date letters to so many lunar cycles since Noah boarded the ark. He was, of course, a great stargazer to the end. But he was also involved in nearly every great Reformation event, and his output was undeniably remarkable. Even his critics relied on his methods and his results. So it is little wonder he is called Praeceptor Germaniae, the teacher of Germany. We still batten upon the rich fruits of his industry today. Melanchthon believed that the exacting scholarship he practiced had utility and value in practical life. He used his high erudition to find footholds when neck-deep in university affairs, church reform, and political conflict. All of his work was written with the conditions of his own time firmly in mind. When he produced the Latin translation of Sophocles' tragedy Antigone, for example, he told his close friend Camerarius, "Not only am I translating it, I am living it." Like the protagonist in the play, he felt himself pulled by every political leader, at the time the German princes and the French and English kings, each of whom expected him to find a solution to an intractable problem, yet he was bound ultimately to God. Similar scenarios played out in his turbulent life time and time again. Yet interpreters very rarely take account of the history of scholarship on Melanchthon, or engage in the kind of close examination of the reformer and the ink blots he left behind that is helpful. They settle often for caricatures and cartoons. To give one concrete example, as dramatic as Thomas Platter and the priest whose grandmother was his Bible. On the 3rd of June, 1555, sometime after 10 p.m. in the evening, rowdy students prowled the streets of Wittenberg. Of course, by itself, this is not unusual. Like all university towns, Wittenberg knew unrest. In 1512, in fact, a student who had been dismissed from the university murdered the rector with an iron cross for revenge. On this night, the students barreled onto College Street, Kollegienstrasse, smack into another noisy gang. Someone barked an insult. Both sides drew swords. When the sharp clang of cutting steel reached the nearby windows of Melanchthon's house, events took another turn. The brilliant, punctilious scholar, whose roof afforded shelter to so many, cherished peace and quiet at the late hour. In fact, he owned the world's earliest known dated watch. In less than a tick, Melanchthon rushed out to meet the violent mob in the street. He snatched a hunter's spear, which he kept by the door, stepped between assailants, and demanded quiet. Upon his word, the armed rioters did go quiet, all that is except one, a young Polish student named Stanislaw Rzuski, who was so new to the city he had only matriculated at the university 3 days before. The student felt personally insulted by this command, so he lifted his blade and lunged wildly at Melanchthon. We might imagine that his classmates held their breath at the sight, for but one outcome would seem inevitable. But Melanchthon, who otherwise jousted with reed pens and feather quills, fought the rages of the apparently mad man with his pike until Rzuski could be subdued. In the morning, the rector of the university addressed the affair in a public speech, a speech which Melanchthon wrote, reminding the community of the behavior expected of Wittenberg students. Rzuski was expelled from the university and escorted out of town, banished from Wittenberg for 8 years. The tale spread quickly. Within a week, reports spiraled far from Saxony, and by November, even Vienna buzzed with the news. In Jena, which was a stronghold of the Geneseo Lutherans, Melanchthon's ferocious enemies, who despised him as a frail and shirking compromiser, betraying what Luther stood for, the Latin poet Johann Stiegel fashioned this sword attack into an epigram and gave it the bold title, The Fortitude of Philip Melanchthon. In subsequent ages, however, even down to the present, you will find almost no book that mentions the battle. Joachim Camerarius published his biography of Melanchthon in 1566, which became quickly the single most important source of Melanchthon's life. Yet Camerarius omitted the crowd-pleasing scene. The reason was simple. It did not fit his highly stylized psychogram of Melanchthon as a gentle humanist with a quiet soul, moderate to a fault, not the kind of person to get involved with sword fights. True, biographers always face difficulties. Camerarius harvested small grains of truth and ingeniously milled them to bake large myths. He did so as part of his rhetorical and polemical defense against Geneseo Lutheran caricatures of Melanchthon, who was his close friend and ally. In 1777, though, an obscure pastor in Nuremberg, Georg Theodor Strobel, produced a new edition of Camerarius's biography, this time with critical footnotes. One shell in a great barrage of Reformation scholarship he fired with gusto. He wrote, Camerarius does not think of this important incident, the sword fight, in Melanchthon's life. This amazes me very much. Surely this story deserves to be referenced and held up as one very remarkable, especially for the sake of all those who would paint timid portraits of Melanchthon the Reformer. Let it not be assumed, Strobel warned, that the tower of erudition turned to jelly in a fight. Strobel had read other obscure scholars like Melchior Adam and Johann Georg Skellhorn on the lives of intellectuals. He had studied institutional records at the University of Wittenberg. He had reverse engineered social networks to conjure the past and write a full record of events. If only more historians and theologians read people like Strobel alongside Camerarius. For his was a Melanchthon, even if one still disagreed with the choices he made, more imposing, more influential, more capable of inflaming his rivals, such as the Catholics Nicholas Granville and Johann Eck, whom he so exasperated when he discussed the doctrine of the Lord's Supper at the Diet of Regensburg in 1541, as Melanchthon himself happily reported, that Eck drank himself to the brink of death and was unable to negotiate the next day. Through a great recovery of long-forgotten or misread letters and speeches, Melanchthon becomes once more flesh and blood. The Reformers lived in a world of ideas, but one made of books and pamphlets, stenographers and manuscripts, papers and ink. The conditions of life and the techniques of writing and printing both limited and expanded their consciousness. This is true as much for the Reformers as for all those who have ever thought and written about them. By remembering to place them in the context in which they worked, we can hope to know them and their writings and the institutions they established better than we have in the past. Let me give one final example of why careful attention to Reformation-era ink is so important, this time from that most Presbyterian of institutions, the Church Committee. Today's discipline committee clerks, as we know them, hark back to yesterday's unseen scribes. Every reader of ecclesiastical documents, every lover of polity, decency, and good order remains in their debt, for without them there would be no surviving record of church business. No committee, therefore no associated team of clerks or scribes, is more important for Reformation theology, piety, and practice in the English-speaking world than the Westminster Assembly, which met from July 1643 to April 1653. True, the Assembly was not a church committee, but a political one. In the midst of an English civil war that was part of a wider war of the three kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland, ruled by Charles I, England's Long Parliament, as we know, set up in London an advisory body of ministers, we call them divines, to reform the church. The advisory body had to admit members from both the House of Commons and the House of Lords to sit in on its plenary sessions. But Protestants remember the Assembly primarily for the documents it produced known as the Westminster Standards, the Confession of Faith, the Shorter Catechism, the Larger Catechism, the Directory for Public Worship. Indeed, Presbyterians the world over still receive and subscribe, that is, write their names beneath, both literally and figuratively, these confessional and catechetical statements as legal and constitutional, as constitutive of the public official teaching and governing of the Church. By the end of the Assembly's first day, on the 1st of July, 1643, the need to record carefully all that would be said and done was rather obvious. On the second day, Parliament appointed 2 scribes to, as it was said, set down all proceedings, Mr. Adoniram Byfield and Mr. Henry Roborough. I don't know if you know those names. Though divines themselves and indispensable pieces to the Westminster puzzle, these 2 men were not, properly speaking, voting members. This fact was made all too clear to them in probably the best debate at the Assembly, whether the scribes should be permitted to sit with their hats on in the Assembly, as did other voting members. To forbid scribes to wear hats would make them easily identifiable, true, but also insult them. In the end, though, it was judged that hats would keep them warm, and warm, behatted scribes would take better notes. Take notes they did. There are rough minutes of Assembly proceedings in early modern shorthand, revised minutes in a more polished hand, registers of votes and decisions, 550,000 words in all. More than one historian has sighed in agony over Byfeld's penmanship. Hurried and abbreviated in style, said one. An execrable 17th century hand, in extraordinary abstruseness and complexity, said another. A rough scrawl made worse by incomplete sentences, erasures, and insertions, said a third. Occasionally, Byfield's personality peeks out from the textual mass, but it is difficult to observe and fleeting, like sun against the London fog. When Anthony Tuckney, master of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, complained that Parliament could be as harsh in rule as the king had been, Byfield put down his pen but indicated that the speech continued. The rest was probably better left unrecorded. He found a speech on Matthew 18 by Philip Nye, the leading Congregationalist at the Assembly, and one of its most called-to-order speakers, to be little to the purpose. He amused himself by writing the name of Paul Best, who was jailed at the time for denying the Trinity at the Gatehouse prison in front of the Westminster Abbey's Great West Door, as Paul Beast. Nevertheless, Byfield and his co-workers are mostly invisible in the documentary evidence. They are record keepers, not record makers. Of course, the scribes were not the only divines to jot down what happened inside Westminster Abbey and its famed Jerusalem chamber where committee work took place. The churchman John Lightfoot, one of England's learned Talmudic scholars, alongside John Selden, also at the Assembly, kept an elegant journal into which he entered summaries of the Assembly's opening months. Robert Bailey ignored rules about confidentiality by sending dispatches of Assembly proceedings across Scotland and Europe. George Gillespie, too, took copious notes, sometimes relocating the order of speeches in his narrative, but he seems to have enjoyed doing so, writing home to Scotland to say, "London is the best place on earth." I don't know if I'm allowed to quote that here. I'll let you be the judge. The minutes produced by the scribes offer a stranger, more remarkable account. Snapshots of impassioned debates, piercing examinations, heartfelt resolutions, hours of nettlesome discussion over many days condensed into a few fragmentary lines. The pace of the Assembly and the toil of the scribes was exhausting. Stephen Marshall, the most frequent preacher before the Parliament and the most frequent speaker at the Assembly, commented, "All our discourses are recorded by the scribes, so far as their pens can reach them." Rarely the scribes miscounted the vote. When they did, it caused, in Lightfoot's words, a great deal of heat. Twice Cornelius Burgess, one of the more important members of the Assembly, required the scribes to improve his sensitive speeches after the fact. For their immense labors, the scribes received the same pay as the other divines, but sometimes they could supplement their meager stipends. In 1645, when the Directory for Public Worship went to print, under Byfield's supervision, the proceeds were split equally among the scribes and the two houses of Parliament. But the minutes provide more than mere antiquarian interest. Not only do they reveal how the assembly worked, but also, and most important for the church, then, perhaps now too, they illuminate what the divines meant when discussing points of profound doctrinal import. Things like the obedience of Christ, the eternal decree, the nature of Christian liberty and liberty of conscience. Chad Van Dixhorn and John Bauer's work on this is wonderful, and everyone should read it. And their verdict is apt. It is chiefly through the Assembly's minutes and papers, aided by other sources such as Parliament's journals and a steady stream of contemporary published works, where the Assembly's day-to-day work to create order amid civil war and ecclesiastical chaos is to be found. It is here where the history of the Confessions text unfolds. In antiquity, unheralded scribes copied out the scriptures. From the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, long-forgotten copyists and printers made possible great books by pastors, theologians, and so many other scholars who are still read today. The scribes at Westminster left behind a long and winding trail of paper, as challenging as it is rewarding to follow. But when we read through it, we can become better readers of the Church's confession. Let me conclude here then with an appeal to all readers and would-be readers of inky-fingered reformers. There are no substitutes for time and imagination when tracing out the total history of the ink they spilt, ink which sometimes runs between and cuts across neat and tidy traditional fields of inquiry, as ink is wont to do. But few pursuits pay as many real dividends. After the Bible itself, historical theology in this sense, in this full sense that encompasses the history of scholarship, is perhaps the crown jewel of what we should be reading. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was absolutely fascinating. Any questions?
Thank you very much. What you were saying about really contrasting Melanchthon with Luther, people do that, I suppose. And I suppose it's a good example of Melanchthon being somebody who tried to work and rework his own ideas and make sure that the published version was it, which is sort of less thinking on a topic. Whereas Luther relies much more on stenographers and people to write down his lectures conflicting. The Council of Those was much more about the word and then it's interpreted in writing. So there is a difference there, I suppose. But I remember reading something by Hans Wallmann or someone who said that those who wrote their sermons in the late 1500s, early 1600s, kind of rather ironically, you think writing sermons would kind of take all the passion out of it. But in fact, the written sermons are actually better at communicating the passion than the rhetoric. Whereas those who just spoke their sermons from notes or just the Bible themselves, relying on people to write them down, to take notes in church, they end up being very desiccated things and not being terribly kind of powerful in the way that we receive them. So it can make a lot of difference, can't it, just how things are recorded?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you repeat it? Well, summarize the question for the sake of
So Professor Mark Elliott has commented on the difference between Melanchthon and Luther in terms of how they operated and wrote and published. And also on the difference between preachers at the time, in the late 16th century, those who preached without notes and those who used a manuscript, and it was commented on even in their age that those with manuscripts retained more passion. I think, is that fair? An excellent point. I think a really interesting case of that is with Calvin himself, right, who entered the pulpit without a manuscript, perhaps notes, but probably only the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament. And from 1549 onward, there's a stenographer hired to transcribe what he said. He didn't really want these things published because he thought he was preaching just to his local congregation, his flock. And Pierre Viret and some of his publishers always criticized him and said, couldn't you speak more beautifully from the pulpit? But of course, I mean, and there's an interesting thing here. So many have taken Calvin as a model for this, and he was a great model to many preachers. But would he have preferred to use a manuscript? Probably. He just didn't simply have time to write one out. So the pace of work just crowded out things like sermon manuscripts. So it does make a tremendous difference the way these things are recorded.
Anyone else?
Zach, thank you very much. Do we have any indications of what kinds of books the reformers would have put into their relatively modest sized libraries? What kinds of things might they have made a priority to work with?
Yeah, a very, very good question. A lot of work has been done on, not all of which I've read, but classical literature above all, I think, would outrank all the other sorts of books. Certainly the Vulgate would be there, the Greek New Testament, Septuagint as well, the Hebrew Bible. As far as what they read of kind of medieval thinkers is still often debated. How much were they, aware of people like Aquinas and others, or are they using commonplace books? Certainly commonplace books. So the place to go there is to read someone like Anne Blair, a great historian at Harvard, who's done all kinds of work on commonplace books. And readers, really, as we think of them today, have their origins in this period where you could have just a book that had quotations from different theologians. I mean, this is what the Sentences is by Lombard in some sense. So, but classics above all, I think, sort of shared appreciation across the board.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about to now realize in the theology matters about the textual criticism. Well, we found in the Hebrew Bible, for example, you mentioned the sector infra, we have the Genesis clause, and when we focus on the New Testament, we found that the critic text shows like a really huge world and different manuscripts and stuff. How we can take that importance of that in the Reformed theology? What's your opinion about this? Is it important to focus on this when we, for example, take the commentaries? Because even with the commentaries, we found a kind of difference, some kind of different weaknesses of the text. I don't know if I'm very clear with your question.
Can you repeat the question then?
Sure. How much were the reformers interested in textual criticism? Is that fair?
Can be important for the scholarship of the students who's approaching to the Bible in this way.
And it's of importance even today. Is that, yeah. I can answer that in two ways. On the one hand, historians don't have to read the Bible, so no, scratch that from the tape. On the other hand, tremendously important to the reformers themselves. They're very interested. They never shy away from doing this kind of thing. Luther's case with Erasmus is an interesting one because he obviously is reading with an agenda, not an open mind. But it's entertaining. Many of the reformers were very interested. Their methods might seem strange to us today, but many wanted to go spend time with Jewish rabbis. So we can learn how to interpret the Hebrew Bible as if 16th century Judaism is the same as it was in the past. So you might quibble with that, but a deep interest in this. Others wanted to go literally to Greece or other places to become better readers of Greek. Martin Crucius, who's a Lutheran disciple of Luther and Melanchthon, who's in Tübingen, is interested in this kind of thing. So, and that continues even explodes really into the early modern period after maybe the Reformation proper. So they're deeply interested in textual criticism, absolutely.
I think at this point, I think we'll bring things to a conclusion. Oh, sorry, yeah, Ian.
Yes, thank you again. I was struck by the picture you painted of colossal erudition from these 16th and 17th century characters. Is it possible to match that level of erudition today, given that we've got how many millions more actually published since?
So again, the question repeated is, we have these Reformation and early modern figures with colossal erudition, given the rate of publication today, and I suppose digitization as well. Can we match that? An important question that I don't know the answer to. It's hard when Netflix is right there. Is the true answer to that question. Digitization and things like that are double-edged swords, because on the one hand you have remarkable resources at your fingertips, but there's also nothing like going to a library and sitting there without a device and just a sheet of paper and a pencil. I have hundreds of thousands of images from archives that I will probably never look at again. That's just simply how it works. Somebody could, I suppose. Somebody should. We have more tools. Our priorities are different as well. The way the world works is certainly different. So it's hard to draw easy comparisons, I suppose. But, an important question to think about, though.
All right, well, there'll be plenty of opportunity to speak to Zach afterwards. I just want to thank him again. I think we should come together and express our thanks once again. Perhaps I could ask you to close in prayer?
Sure. O Lord our God, Father of all mercies, we thank you that you have met us in our deepest need through your Son, that your Spirit unites us to Christ in faith. We thank you that you are the great three in one. We pray that our time here, as we continue to teach and study at ETS, would be pleasing to you, and that your work would go on as you see fit for it to do so. All these things we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Just before everyone goes, we're not only delighted to have this event in person, but we're also delighted that we're going to have the closing ceremony in person for the first time in 3 years. That's going to be on May the 13th. That'll be St. Columba's on Johnson Terrace, and it is the highlight of the year. It's the time when we are able to mark, particularly the completion of studies for those who are leaving, and it's not only a time when they can come together and celebrate their achievement, but it's also a time of hope